Part 3. Contradiction and Overdetermination. Notes for an investigation. For Margaret and Gué. With Hegel, it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. Karl Marx, Capital. In an article devoted to the young Marx, I have already stressed the ambiguity of the idea of inverting Hegel. It seemed to me that strictly speaking this expression suited Feuerbach perfectly. The latter did, indeed, turn speculative philosophy back onto its feet, but the only result was to arrive with implacable logic at an idealist anthropology. But the expression cannot be applied to Marx, at least not to the Marx who had grown out of this anthropological phase. I could go further, and suggest that in the well-known passage, with Hegel, the dialectic is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. This turning right side up again is merely gestural, even metaphorical, and it raises as many questions as it answers. How should we really understand its use in this quotation? It is no longer a matter of a general inversion of Hegel, that is, the inversion of speculative philosophy as such. From the German ideology onwards we know that such an undertaking would be meaningless. Anyone who claims purely and simply to have inverted speculative philosophy, to derive, for example, materialism, can never be more than philosophy's Proudhon, its unconscious prisoner, just as Proudhon was the prisoner of bourgeois economics. We are now concerned with the dialectic, and the dialectic alone. It might be thought that when Marx writes that we must discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell, he means that the rational kernel is the dialectic itself, while the mystical shell is speculative philosophy. Engels's time-honored distinction between method and system implies precisely this. The shell, the mystical wrapping, speculative philosophy, should be tossed aside and the precious kernel, the dialectic, retained. But in the same sentence Marx claims that this shelling of the kernel and the inversion of the dialectic are one and the same thing. How can an extraction be an inversion? Or in other words, what is inverted during this extraction? Let us look a little closer. As soon as the dialectic is removed from its idealistic shell, it becomes the direct opposite of the Hegelian dialectic. Does this mean that for Marx, far from dealing with Hegel's sublimated, inverted world, it is applied to the real world? This is certainly the sense in which Hegel was the first consciously to expose its general forms of movement in depth. We could therefore take over the dialectic from him and apply it to life rather than to the idea. The inversion would then be an inversion of the sense of the dialectic. But such an inversion in sense would in fact leave the dialectic untouched. Taking young Marx as an example, in the article referred to above, I suggested that to take over the dialectic in rigorous Hegelian form could only expose us to dangerous ambiguities, for it is impossible given the principles of a Marxist interpretation of any ideological phenomenon. It is unthinkable that the place of the dialectic in Hegel's system could be conceived as that of a kernel in a nut. By which I meant that it is inconceivable that the essence of the dialectic in Hegel's work should not be contaminated by Hegelian ideology, or, since such a contamination presupposes the fiction of a pure precontamination dialectic, that the Hegelian dialectic could cease to be Hegelian and become Marxist by a simple, miraculous extraction. Even in the rapidly written lines of the afterword to the second edition of Das Kapital, Marx saw this difficulty clearly. By the accumulation of metaphors, and, in particular, in the remarkable encounter of the extraction and the inversion, he not only hints at something more than he says, but in other passages he puts it clearly enough, though Roy has half-spirited them away. A close reading of the German text shows clearly enough that the mystical shell is by no means, as some of Engels's later commentaries would lead one to think, speculative philosophy, or its world outlook or its system, that is, an element we can regard as external to its method, but refers directly to the dialectic itself. Marx goes so far as to talk of the mystification the dialectic suffered at Hegel's hands, of its mystificatory side, its mystified form. And he opposes precisely to this mystified form of the Hegelian dialectic the rational figure of his own dialectic. It would be difficult to indicate more clearly that the mystical shell is nothing but the mystified form of the dialectic itself, that is, not a relatively external element of the dialectic, For example, the system, but an internal element, consubstantial with the Hegelian dialectic. It is not enough, therefore, to disengage it from its first wrapping, the system, to free it. It must also be freed from a second, almost inseparable skin, which is itself Hegelian in principle. We must admit that this extraction cannot be painless, an appearance and unpeeling. It is really a demystification, an operation which transforms what it extracts. So I think that, in its approximation, this metaphorical expression, the inversion of the dialectic, does not pose the problem of the nature of the objects to which a single method should be applied, the world of the idea for Hegel, the real world for Marx, but rather the problem of the nature of the dialectic considered itself, that is, the problem of its specific structures, not the problem of the inversion of the sense of the dialectic, but that of the transformation of its structures. It is hardly worth pointing out that, in the first case, the application of a method, the exteriority of the dialectic to its possible objects, poses a pre-dialectical question, a question without any strict meaning for Marx. The second problem, on the other hand, raises a real question to which it is hardly likely that Marx and his disciples should not have given a concrete answer in theory and practice, in theory or in practice. Let us say, to end this overextended textual exposition, that if the Marxist dialectic is, in principle, the opposite of the Hegelian dialectic, if it is rational and not mystical mystified mystificatory, this radical distinction must be manifest in its essence, that is, in its characteristic determinations and structures. To be clear, this means that basic structures of the Hegelian dialectic, such as negation, the negation of the negation, the identity of opposites, supersession, the transformation of quantity into quality, contradiction, etc., have for Marx, and so far as he takes them over, and he takes over by no means all of them, a structure different from the structure they have for Hegel. It also means that these structural differences can be demonstrated, described, determined in thought. And if this is possible, it is therefore necessary, I would go so far as to say vital, for Marxism. We cannot go on reiterating indefinitely approximations such as the difference between system and method, the inversion of philosophy or dialectic, the extraction of the rational kernel, and so on, without letting these formulae think for us, that is, stop thinking ourselves and trust ourselves to the magic of a number of completely devalued words for our completion of Marx's work. I say vital, for I am convinced that the philosophical development of Marxism currently depends on this task. As this is also a personal responsibility, whatever risks I shall run, I should like to attempt a moment's reflection on the Marxist concept of contradiction, in respect to a particular example, the Leninist theme of the weakest link. Lenin gave this metaphor above all a practical meaning. A chain is as strong as its weakest link. In general, anyone who wants to control a given situation will look out for a weak point, in case it should render the whole system vulnerable. On the other hand, anyone who wants to attack it, even if the odds are apparently against him, need only discover this one weakness to make all its power precarious. So far there is no revelation here for readers of Machiavelli and Vauban, who were as expert in the arts of the defense as of the destruction of a position, and judged all armor by its faults. But here we should pay careful attention, if it is obvious that the theory of the weakest link guided Lenin in his theory of the Revolutionary Party. It was to be faultlessly united in consciousness and organization to avoid adverse exposure and to destroy the enemy. It was also the inspiration for his reflections on the revolution itself. How was this revolution possible in Russia? Why was it victorious there? It was possible in Russia for a reason that went beyond Russia, because with the unleashing of imperialist war humanity entered into an objectively revolutionary situation. Imperialism tore off the peaceful mask of the old capitalism. The concentration of industrial monopolies, their subordination to financial monopolies, had increased the exploitation of the workers and of the colonies. Competition between the monopolies made war inevitable. But this same war, which dragged vast masses, even colonial peoples from whom troops were drawn, into limitless suffering, drove its cannon fodder not only into massacres, but also into history. Everywhere the experience, the horrors of war, were a revelation and confirmation of a whole century's protest against capitalist exploitation, a focusing point, too, for hand in hand with this shattering exposure went the effective means of action. But though this effect was felt throughout the greater part of the popular masses of Europe, revolution in Germany and Hungary, mutinies and mass strikes in France and Italy, the Turin Soviets, only in Russia, precisely the most backward country in Europe, did it produce a triumphant revolution. Why this paradoxical exception? For this basic reason, in the system of imperialist states Russia represented the weakest point. The Great War had, of course, precipitated and aggravated this weakness, but it had not by itself created it. Already, even in defeat, the 1905 revolution had demonstrated and measured the weakness of Tsarist Russia. This weakness was the product of this special feature, the accumulation and exacerbation of all the historical contradictions then possible in a single state. Contradictions of a regime of feudal exploitation at the dawn of the 20th century, attempting ever more ferociously amidst mounting threats to rule, with the aid of a deceitful priesthood, over an enormous mass of ignorant peasants, circumstances which dictated a singular association of the peasants' revolt with the workers' revolution. Contradictions of large-scale capitalist and imperialist exploitation in the major cities and their suburbs, in the mining regions, oil fields, etc. Contradictions of colonial exploitation and wars imposed on whole peoples. A gigantic contradiction between the stage of development of capitalist methods of production, particularly in respect to proletarian concentration. The largest factory in the world at the time was the Putilov Works at Petrograd, with 40,000 workers and auxiliaries, and the medieval state of the countryside. The exacerbation of class struggles throughout the country, not only between exploiter and exploited, but even within the ruling classes themselves, the great feudal proprietors supporting autocratic, militaristic police czarism, the lesser nobility involved in constant conspiracy, the big bourgeoisie and the liberal bourgeoisie opposed to the czar, the petty bourgeoisie oscillating between conformism and anarchistic leftism. The detailed course of events added other exceptional circumstances, incomprehensible outside the tangle of Russia's internal and external contradictions. For example, the advanced character of the Russian revolutionary elite, exiled by Tsarist repression, and exile it became cultivated. It absorbed the whole heritage of the political experience of the Western European working classes, above all, Marxism. This was particularly true of the formation of the Bolshevik Party, far ahead of any Western socialist party in consciousness and organization. The dress rehearsal for the revolution in 1905, which, in common with most serious crises, set class relations sharply into relief, crystallized them and made possible the discovery of a new form of mass political organization, the Soviets. Last, but not the least remarkable, the unexpected respite the exhausted imperialist nations allowed the Bolsheviks for them to make their opening in history. The involuntary but effective support of the Anglo-French bourgeoisie, who, at the decisive moment, wishing to be rid of the Tsar, did everything to help the revolution. In short, as precisely these details show, the privileged situation of Russia with respect to the possible revolution was a matter of an accumulation and exacerbation of historical contradictions that would have been incomprehensible in any country which was not, as Russia was, simultaneously at least a century behind the imperialist world, and at the peak of its development. Lenin said this time and time again, and Stalin summarized it in particularly clear terms in his April 1924 speeches. The unevenness of capitalist development led, via the 1914-18 war, to the Russian Revolution because in the revolutionary situation facing the whole of humanity Russia was the weakest link in the chain of imperialist states. It had accumulated the largest sum of historical contradictions then possible, for it was at the same time the most backward and the most advanced nation, a gigantic contradiction which its divided ruling classes could neither avoid nor solve. In other words, Russia was overdue with its bourgeois revolution on the eve of its proletarian revolution, pregnant with two revolutions. It could not withhold the second even by delaying the first. This exceptional situation was insoluble for the ruling classes, and Lenin was correct to see in it the objective conditions of a Russian revolution, and to forge its subjective conditions, the means of a decisive assault on this weak link in the imperialist chain, and a communist party that was a chain without weak links. What else did Marx and Engels mean when they declared that history always progresses by its bad side? This obviously means the worst side for the rulers, but without stretching the sense unduly we can interpret the bad side as the bad side for those who expect history from another side. For example, the German Social Democrats at the end of the 19th century imagined that they would shortly be promoted to socialist triumph by virtue of belonging to the most powerful capitalist state, then undergoing rapid economic growth, just as they were experiencing rapid electoral growth. Such coincidences do occur. They obviously saw history as progressing by the other side, the good side, the side with the greatest economic development, the greatest growth, with its contradiction reduced to the purest form, the contradiction between capital and labor. So they forgot that all this was taking place in a Germany armed with a powerful state machine, endowed with a bourgeoisie which had long ago given up its political revolution in exchange for Bismarck's, and later Wilhelm's, military, bureaucratic, and police protection, in exchange for the superprofits of capitalist and colonialist exploitation, endowed, too, with a chauvinist and reactionary petty bourgeoisie. They forgot that, in fact, this simple quintessence of contradiction was quite simply abstract. The real contradiction was so much one with its circumstances that it was only discernible, identifiable, and manipulable through them and in them. What is the essence of this practical experience and the reflections it inspired in Lenin? It should be pointed out immediately that this was not Lenin's sole illuminating experience. Before 1917 there was 1905, before 1905 the great historical deceptions of England and Germany, before that the Commune, even earlier the German failure of 1848-9. These experiences had been reflected on Rout, Engels, revolution and counter-revolution in Germany, Marx, the class struggles in France, the civil war in France, the 18th Brumaire, the critique of the Gotha program, Engels, the critique of the Erfurt program, and so on, directly or indirectly, and had been related to even earlier revolutionary experience, to the bourgeois revolutions of England and France. How else should we summarize these practical experiences and their theoretical commentaries other than by saying that the whole Marxist revolutionary experience shows that, if the general contradiction, it has already been specified, the contradiction between the forces of production and the relations of production, essentially embodied in the contradiction between two antagonistic classes, is sufficient to define the situation when revolution is the task of the day. It cannot of its own simple, direct power induce a revolutionary situation, nor a fortiori a situation of revolutionary rupture and the triumph of the revolution. If this contradiction is to become active in the strongest sense, to become a ruptural principle, there must be an accumulation of circumstances and currents so that whatever their origin and sense, and many of them will necessarily be paradoxically foreign to the revolution in origin and sense, or even its direct opponents, they fuse into a ruptural unity, when they produce the result of the immense majority of the popular masses grouped in an assault on a regime which its ruling classes are unable to defend. Such a situation presupposes not only the fusion of the two basic conditions into a single national crisis, but each condition considered, abstractly, by itself presupposes the fusion of an accumulation of contradictions. How else could the class-divided popular masses, proletarians, peasants, petty bourgeois, throw themselves together, consciously or unconsciously, into a general assault on the existing regime? And how else could the ruling classes, aristocrats, big bourgeois, industrial bourgeois, finance bourgeois, etc., who have learned by long experience and sure instinct to seal between themselves, despite their class differences, a holy alliance against the exploited, find themselves reduced to impotence, divided at the decisive moment, with neither new political solutions nor new political leaders, deprived of foreign class support, disarmed in the very citadel of their state machine, and suddenly overwhelmed by the people they had so long kept in leash and respectful by exploitation, violence, and deceit? If, as in this situation, a vast accumulation of contradictions comes into play in the same court, some of which are radically heterogeneous of different origins, different sense, different levels and points of application, but which nevertheless merge into a ruptural unity, we can no longer talk of the sole, unique power of the general contradiction. Of course, the basic contradiction dominating the period, when the revolution is the task of the day, is active in all these contradictions and even in their fusion. But, strictly speaking, it cannot be claimed that these contradictions and their fusion are merely the pure phenomena of the general contradiction. The circumstances and currents which achieve it are more than its phenomena pure and simple. They derive from the relations of production, which are, of course, one of the terms of the contradiction, but at the same time its conditions of existence, from the superstructures, instances which derive from it, but have their own consistency and effectivity, from the international conjuncture itself, which intervenes as a determination with a specific role to play. This means that if the differences that constitute each of the instances in play, manifested in the accumulation discussed by Lenin, merge into a real unity, they are not dissipated as pure phenomena in the internal unity of a simple contradiction. The unity they constitute in this fusion into a revolutionary rupture is constituted by their own essence and effectivity, by what they are, and according to the specific modalities of their action. In constituting this unity, they reconstitute and complete their basic animating unity, but at the same time they also bring out its nature. The contradiction is inseparable from the total structure of the social body in which it is found, inseparable from its formal conditions of existence, and even from the instances it governs. It is radically affected by them, determining, but also determined in one and the same movement, and determined by the various levels and instances of the social formation it animates. It might be called overdetermined in its principle. I am not particularly taken by this term overdetermination, borrowed from other disciplines, but I shall use it in the absence of anything better, both as an index and as a problem, and also because it enables us to see clearly why we are dealing with something quite different from the Hegelian contradiction. Indeed, a Hegelian contradiction is never really overdetermined, even though it frequently has all the appearances of being so. For example, in the Phenomenology of Mind, which describes the experiences of consciousness and their dialectic, culminating in absolute knowledge, contradiction does not appear to be simple, but on the contrary very complex. Strictly speaking, only the first contradiction between sensuous consciousness and its knowledge can be called simple. The further we progress in the dialectic of its production, the richer consciousness becomes, the more complex is its contradiction. However, it can be shown that this complexity is not the complexity of an effective overdetermination, but the complexity of a cumulative internalization which is only apparently an overdetermination. In fact, at each moment of its development consciousness lives and experiences its own essence, the essence corresponding to the stage it has attained, through all the echoes of the essence it has previously been, and through the elusive presence of the corresponding historical forms. Hegel, therefore, argues that every consciousness has a suppressed conserved past even in its present, and a world, the world whose consciousness it could be, but which is marginal in the phenomenology, its presence virtual and latent, and that therefore it also has as its past the worlds of its superseded essences. But these past images of consciousness and these latent worlds, corresponding to the images, never affect present consciousness as effective determinations different from itself. These images and worlds concern it only as echoes, memories, phantoms of its historicity, of what it has become, that is, as anticipations of or allusions to itself. Because the past is never more than the internal essence, in itself, of the future it encloses, this presence of the past is the presence to consciousness of consciousness itself, and no true external determination. A circle of circles, consciousness has only one center, which solely determines it. It would need circles with another center than itself, decent red circles, for it to be affected at its center by their effectivity, in short, for its essence to be overdetermined by them. But this is not the case. This truth emerges even more clearly from the philosophy of history. Here again we encounter an apparent overdetermination. Are not all historical societies constituted of an infinity of concrete determinations, from political laws to religion via customs, habits, financial, commercial and economic regimes, the educational system, the arts, philosophy, and so on? However, none of these determinations is essentially outside the others, not only because together they constitute an original, organic totality, but also and above all because this totality is reflected in a unique internal principle, which is the truth of all those concrete determinations. Thus Rome, its mighty history, its institutions, its crises and ventures, are nothing but the temporal manifestation of the internal principle of the abstract legal personality, and then its destruction. Of course, this internal principle contains as echoes the principle of each of the historical formations it has superseded, but as echoes of itself, that is why, too, it only has one center, the center of all the past worlds conserved in its memory, that is why it is simple. And its own contradiction appears in this very simplicity. In Rome, the Stoic consciousness, as consciousness of the contradiction inherent in the concept of the abstract legal personality, which aims for the concrete world of subjectivity, but misses it. This is the contradiction which will bring down Rome and produce its future, the image of subjectivity in medieval Christianity. So all Rome's complexity fails to overdetermine the contradiction in the simple Roman principle, which is merely the internal essence of this infinite historical wealth. We have only to ask why Hegel thought the phenomena of historical mutation in terms of this simple concept of contradiction, to pose what is precisely the essential question. The simplicity of the Hegelian contradiction is made possible only by the simplicity of the internal principle that constitutes the essence of any historical period. If it is possible, in principle, to reduce the totality, the infinite diversity, of a historically given society, Greece, Rome, the Holy Roman Empire, England, and so on, to a simple internal principle, this very simplicity can be reflected in the contradiction to which it thereby acquires a right. Must we be even plainer? This reduction itself, Hegel derived the idea from Montesquieu, the reduction of all the elements that make up the concrete life of a historical epoch, economic, social, political and legal institutions, customs, ethics, art, religion, philosophy, and even historical events, wars, battles, defeats, and so on, to one principle of internal unity, is itself only possible on the absolute condition of taking the whole concrete life of a people for the externalization, alienation of an internal spiritual principle, which can never definitely be anything but the most abstract form of that epoch's consciousness of itself, its religious or philosophical consciousness, that is, its own ideology. I think we can now see how the mystical shell affects and contaminates the kernel, for the simplicity of Hegelian contradiction is never more than a reflection of the simplicity of this internal principle, of a people, that is, not its material reality but its most abstract ideology. It is also why Hegel could represent universal history from the ancient Orient to the present day as dialectical, that is, moved by the simple play of a principle of simple contradiction. It is why there is never for him any basic rupture, no actual end to any real history, nor any radical beginning. It is why his philosophy of history is garnished with uniformly dialectical mutations. This stupefying conception is only defensible from the spirit's topmost peak. From that vantage point, what does it matter if a people die once it has embodied the determinate principle of a moment of the idea, which has plenty more to come, once, having embodied it, it has cast it off to add it to that self-memory which is history, thereby delivering it to such and such another people, even if their historical relation is very tenuous, who, reflecting it in their substance, will find in it the promise of their own internal principle, that is, as if by chance the logically consecutive moment of the idea, etc., etc. It must be clear that all these arbitrary decisions, shot through though they are with insights of genius, are not just miraculously confined to Hegel's world outlook, to his system, but are reflected in the structure, in the very structures of his dialectic, particularly in the contradiction whose task is the magical movement of the concrete contents of a historical epoch towards their ideological goal. Thus the Marxist inversion of the Hegelian dialectic is something quite different from an extraction pure and simple. If we clearly perceive the intimate and close relation that the Hegelian structure of the dialectic has with Hegel's world outlook, that is, with his speculative philosophy, this world outlook cannot really be cast aside without our being obliged to transform profoundly the structures of that dialectic. If not, whether we will or no, we shall drag along with us, 150 years after Hegel's death and 100 years after Marx, the shreds of the famous mystical wrapping. Let us return to Lenin and thence to Marx. If it is true, as Leninist practice and reflection prove, that the revolutionary situation in Russia was precisely a result of the intense overdetermination of the basic class contradiction, we should perhaps ask what is exceptional about this exceptional situation, and whether, like all exceptions, this one does not clarify its rule is not, unbeknown to the rule itself. For, after all, are we not always in exceptional situations? The failure of the 1849 revolution in Germany was an exception. The failure in Paris in 1871 was an exception. The German social democratic failure at the beginning of the 20th century pending the chauvinist betrayal of 1914 was an exception. Exceptions, but with respect to what? To nothing but the abstract, but comfortable and reassuring idea of a pure, simple dialectical schema, which in its very simplicity seems to have retained a memory, or rediscovered the style, of the Hegelian model and its faith in the resolving power of the abstract contradiction as such, in particular, the beautiful contradiction between capital and labor. I do not deny that the simplicity of this purified schema has answered to certain subjective necessities of the mobilization of the masses. After all, we know perfectly well that the utopian forms of socialism also played a historical part, and played it well because they took the masses at the word of their consciousness, because if they are to be led forward, even, and above all, this is how they must be taken. One day it will be necessary to do what Marx and Engels did for utopian socialism, but this time for those still schematic utopian forms of mass consciousness influenced by Marxism, even the consciousness of certain of its theoreticians, in the first stage of its history, a true historical study of the conditions and forms of that consciousness. In fact, we find that all the important historical and political articles written by Marx and Engels during this period give us precisely the material for a preliminary reflection on these so-called exceptions. They draw from them the basic notion that the capital-labor contradiction is never simple, but always specified by the historically concrete forms and circumstances in which it is exercised. It is specified by the forms of the superstructure, the state, the dominant ideology, religion, politically organized movements, and so on. Specified by the internal and external historical situation which determines it on the one hand as a function of the national past, completed or relapsed bourgeois revolution, fuel exploitation eliminated wholly, partially, or not at all, local customs, specific national traditions, even the etiquette of political struggles and behavior, etc., and on. The other is functions of the existing world context, what dominates it, competition of capitalist nations, or imperialist internationalism, or competition within imperialism, etc. Many of these phenomena deriving from the law of uneven development in the Leninist sense. What can this mean but that the apparently simple contradiction is always overdetermined? The exception thus discovers in itself the rule of the rule, and the old exceptions must be regarded as methodologically simple examples of the new rule. To extend the analysis to all phenomena using this rule, I should like to suggest that an overdetermined contradiction may either be overdetermined in the direction of a historical inhibition, a real block for the contradiction, for example, Wilhelmine Germany, or in the direction of revolutionary rupture, Russia in 1917. But in neither condition is it ever found in the pure state. Purity itself would be the exception, I agree, but I know of no example to refer to. But if every contradiction appears in Marxist historical practice and experience as an overdetermined contradiction, if this overdetermination constitutes the specificity of Marxist contradiction, if the simplicity of the Hegelian dialectic is inseparable from Hegel's world outlook, particularly the conception of history it reflects, we must ask what is the content, the raison d'etre of the overdetermination of Marxist contradiction, and how can the Marxist conception of society be reflected in this overdetermination? This is a crucial question, for it is obvious that if we cannot demonstrate the necessary link that unites the characteristic structure of contradiction for Marx to his conception of society and history, if this overdetermination is not based on the very concepts of the Marxist theory of history, the category will remain up in the air. For however accurate and verified it may be in political practice, we have only so far used it descriptively, that is, contingently, and like all descriptions it is still at the mercy of any philosophical theory that happens to come along. But this raises the ghost of the Hegelian model again, not of its abstract model of contradiction, but of the concrete model of the conception of history reflected in it. If we are to prove that the specific structure of Marxist contradiction is based on Marx's conception of history, we must first ensure that this conception is not itself a mere inversion of the Hegelian conception, pure and simple. It is true that we could argue as a first approximation that Marx inverted the Hegelian conception of history. This can be quickly illustrated. The whole Hegelian conception is regulated by the dialectic of the internal principles of each society, that is, the dialectic of the moments of the idea, as Marx said 20 times. Hegel explains the material life, the concrete history of all peoples by a dialectic of consciousness, the people's consciousness of itself, its ideology. For Marx, on the other hand, the material life of men explains their history, their consciousness, their ideologies are then merely the phenomena of their material life. This opposition certainly unites all the appearances of an inversion. To push this to extremes, almost to caricature, what do we find in Hegel? A conception of society which takes over the achievements of 18th century political theory and political economy, and regards every society, every modern society of course, but the present reveals what was once only a germ, as constituted by two societies, the society of needs, or civil society, and the political society or state and everything embodied in the state, religion, philosophy, in short, the epic's consciousness of itself. In other words, schematically, by material life on the one hand and spiritual life on the other. For Hegel, material life, civil society, that is, the economy, is merely a ruse of reason. Apparently autonomous, it is subject to a law outside itself, its own goal, which is simultaneously its condition of possibility, the state, that is, spiritual life. So here again we have a way of inverting Hegel which would apparently give us Marx. It is simply to invert the relation of the terms, and thus to retain them, civil society and state, economy and politics ideology, but to transform the essence into the phenomena and the phenomena into an essence, or if you prefer, to make the ruse of reason work backwards. While for Hegel, the politico-ideological was the essence of the economic, for Marx, the economic will be the essence of the politico-ideological. The political and the ideological will therefore be merely pure phenomena of the economic which will be their truth. For Hegel's pure principle of consciousness, of the epic's consciousness of itself, for the simple internal principle which he conceived as the principle of the intelligibility of all the determinations of a historical people, we have substituted another simple principle, its opposite, material life, the economy, a simple principle which in turn becomes the sole principle of the universal intelligibility of all the determinations of a historical people. Is this a caricature? If we take Marx's famous comments on the hand mill, the water mill, and the steam mill literally or out of context, this is their meaning. The logical destination of this temptation is the exact mirror image of the Hegelian dialectic, the only difference being that it is no longer a question of deriving the successive moments from the idea, but from the economy, by virtue of the same internal contradiction. This temptation results in the radical reduction of the dialectic of history to the dialectic generating the successive modes of production, that is, in the last analysis, the different production techniques. There are names for these temptations in the history of Marxism, economism, and even technologism. But these terms have only to be mentioned to evoke the memory of the theoretical and practical struggles of Marx and his disciples against these deviations. And how many peremptory attacks on economism there are to counterbalance that well-thumbed piece on the steam engine. Let us abandon this caricature, not so as to oppose the official condemnations to economism, but to examine what authentic principles are active in these condemnations and in Marx's actual thought. For all its apparent rigor, the fiction of the inversion is now clearly untenable. We know that Marx did not retain the terms of the Hegelian model of society and invert them. He substituted other, only distantly related terms for them. Furthermore, he overhauled the connection which had previously ruled over the terms. For Marx, both terms and relation changed in nature and sense. Firstly, the terms are no longer the same. Of course, Marx still talks of civil society, especially in the German ideology. The term is often mistranslated as bourgeois society, but as an allusion to the past, to denote the site of his discoveries, not to reutilize the concept. The formation of this concept requires closer examination. Beneath the abstract forms of the political philosophy of the 18th century and the more concrete forms of its political economy, we discover not a true theory of economic history, nor even a true economic theory, but a description and foundation of economic behavior, in short, a sort of philosophico-economic phenomenology. What is remarkable in this undertaking, as much in its philosophers, Locke, Helvetius, etc., as in its economists, Turgot, Smith, etc., is that this description of civil society acts as if it were the description and foundation of what Hegel, aptly summarizing its spirit, called the world of needs, a world related immediately, as if to its internal essence, to the relations of individuals defined by their particular wishes, personal interests, in short, their needs. We know that Marx's whole conception of political economy is based on a critique of this presupposition, the homo economicus and its ethical and legal abstraction, the man of philosophy. How then could he take over a concept which is its direct product? Neither this abstract description of economic behavior nor its supposed foundation in the mythical homo economicus interested Marx. His concern was rather the anatomy of this world, and the dialectic of the mutations of this anatomy. Therefore, the concept of civil society, the world of individual economic behavior, and its ideological origin disappears from Marx's work. He understands abstract economic reality, which Smith, for example, rediscovers in the laws of the market as a result of his work of foundation, as the effect of a deeper, more concrete reality, the mode of production of a determinate social formation. Thus, for the first time, individual economic behavior, which was the pretext for this economico-philosophical phenomenology, is measured according to its conditions of existence. The degree of development of the forces of production, the state of the relations of production, these are from now on the basic Marxist concepts. Civil society may well have gestured towards the site of the new concepts, dig here, but we must admit that it did not even contribute to their material. But where in Hegel would you find all that? As for the state, it is only too easy to show that it no longer has the same content for Marx as it had for Hegel. Not just because the state can no longer be the reality of the idea, but also and primarily because it is systematically thought as an instrument of coercion in the service of the ruling, exploiting class. Beneath the description and sublimation of the attributes of the state, Marx finds here also a new concept, foreshadowed in the 18th century, Linguet, Rousseau, etc., taken up even by Hegel in his philosophy of right, making it into a phenomenon of the ruse of reason which triumphs in the state, the opposition of wealth and poverty, and abundantly used by the historians of the 1830s, the concept of social class, and direct relation with the relations of production. The intervention of this new concept and its interconnection with one of the basic concepts of the economic structure transforms the essence of the state from top to toe, for the latter is no longer above human groups, but at the service of the ruling class. It is no longer its mission to consummate itself in art, religion, and philosophy, but to set them to serve the interests of the ruling class, or rather to force them to base themselves on ideas and themes which it renders ruling. It therefore ceases to be the truth of civil society, to become, not the truth of something else, not even of the economy, but the means of action and domination of a social class, etc. But it is not just the terms which change, it is also their relations themselves. We should not think that this means a new technical distribution of roles imposed by the multiplication of new terms. How are these new terms arranged? On the one hand, the structure, the economic base, the forces of production and the relations of production. On the other, the superstructure, the state and all the legal, political and ideological forms. We have seen that one could nevertheless attempt to maintain a Hegelian relation, the relation Hegel imposed between civil society and the state, between these two groups of categories. The relation between an essence and its phenomena, sublimated in the concept of the truth of. For Hegel, the state is the truth of civil society, which, thanks to the action of the ruse of reason, is merely its own phenomenon consummated in it. For Marx, thus relegated to the rank of a Hobbes or a Locke, civil society would be nothing but the truth of its phenomenon, the state, nothing but a ruse which economic reason would then put at the service of a class, the ruling class. Unfortunately for this neat schema, this is not Marx. For him, this tacit identity, phenomenon essence truth of the economic and the political disappears in favor of a new conception of the relation between determinate instances in the structure-superstructure complex which constitutes the essence of any social formation. Of course, these specific relations between structure and superstructure still deserve theoretical elaboration and investigation. However, Marx has at least given us the two ends of the chain, and has told us to find out what goes on between them. On the one hand, determination in the last instance by the economic mode of production. On the other, the relative autonomy of the superstructures and their specific effectivity. This clearly breaks with the Hegelian principle of explanation by consciousness of self, ideology, but also with the Hegelian theme of phenomenon essence truth of. We really are dealing with a new relationship between new terms. Listen to the old Engels in 1890, taking the young economists to task for not having understood that this was a new relationship. Production is the determinant factor, but only in the last instance. More than this neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Anyone who twists this so that it says that the economic factor is the only determinant factor transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, empty phrase. And as explanation, the economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, the political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., juridical forms, and then even the reflexes of all these actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views and their further development into systems of dogmas also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles, and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. The word form should be understood in its strongest sense, designating something quite different from the formal. As Engels also says, the Prussian state also arose and developed from historical, ultimately economic causes. But it could scarcely be maintained without pedantry that among the many small states of North Germany, Brandenburg was specifically determined by economic necessity to become the great power embodying the economic, linguistic, and, after the Reformation, also the religious difference between North and South, and not by other elements as well, above all by the entanglement with Poland, owing to the possession of Prussia, and hence with international political relations, which were indeed also decisive in the formation of the Austrian dynastic power. Here, then, are the two ends of the chain. The economy is determinate, but in the last instance, Engels is prepared to say, in the long run, the run of history. But history asserts itself through the multiform world of the superstructures, from local tradition to international circumstance. Leaving aside the theoretical solution Engels proposes for the problem of the relation between determination in the last instance, the economic, and those determinations imposed by the superstructures, national traditions and international events, it is sufficient to retain from him what should be called the accumulation of effective determinations, deriving from the superstructures and from special national and international circumstances on the determination in the last instance by the economic. It seems to me that this clarifies the expression overdetermined contradiction, which I have put forward, this specifically because the existence of overdetermination is no longer a fact pure and simple, for in its essentials we have related it to its basis, even if our exposition has so far been merely gestural. This overdetermination is inevitable and thinkable as soon as the real existence of the forms of the superstructure and of the national and international conjuncture has been recognized in existence, largely specific and autonomous, and therefore irreducible to a pure phenomenon. We must carry this through to its conclusion and say that this overdetermination does not just refer to apparently unique and aberrant historical situations, Germany, for example, but is universal. The economic dialectic is never active in the pure state. In history, these instances, the superstructures, etc., are never seen to step respectfully aside when their work is done or, when the time comes, as his pure phenomena, to scatter before His Majesty the economy as he strides along the royal road of the dialectic. From the first moment to the last, the lonely hour of the last instance never comes. In short, the idea of a pure and simple non-overdetermined contradiction is, as Engels said of the economist, turn of phrase meaningless, abstract, senseless. That it can serve as a pedagogical model, or rather that it did serve as a polemical and pedagogical instrument at a certain point in history does not fix its destiny for all time. After all, pedagogic systems do change in history. It is time to make the effort to raise pedagogy to the level of circumstances, that is, of historical needs. But we must all be able to see that this pedagogical effort presupposes another purely theoretical effort. For if Marx has given us the general principles and some concrete examples, the 18th Brumaire, the Civil War in France, etc., if all political practice in the history of socialist and communist movements constitutes an inexhaustible reservoir of concrete experiential protocol, it has to be said that the theory of the specific effectivity of the superstructures and other circumstances largely remains to be elaborated, and before the theory of their effectivity or simultaneously, for it is by formulating their effectivity that their essence can be attained. There must be elaboration of the theory of the particular essence of the specific elements of the superstructure. Like the map of Africa before the great explorations, this theory remains a realm sketched in outline, with its great mountain chains and rivers, but often unknown in detail beyond a few well-known regions. Who has really attempted to follow up the explorations of Marx and Engels? I can only think of Gramsci. But this task is indispensable if we are to be able to express even propositions more precise than these approximations on the character of the overdetermination of Marxist contradiction, based primarily on the existence and nature of the superstructures. Allow me one last example. Marxist political practice is constantly coming up against that reality known as survivals. There can be no doubt that these survivals exist. They cling tenaciously to life. Lenin struggled with them inside the Russian Party even before the revolution. We do not need to be reminded that after the revolution and from then till now they have been the source of constant difficulties, battles, and commentaries. What is the survivals? What is its theoretical status? Is it essentially social or psychological? Can it be reduced to the survival of certain economic structures which the revolution was unable to destroy with its first decrees, for example, the small-scale production, primarily peasant production in Russia, which so preoccupied Lenin? Or does it refer as much to other structures, political, ideological structures, etc., customs, habits, even traditions such as the national tradition with its specific traits? The term survival is constantly invoked, but it is still virtually uninvestigated. Not in its name, it has won, but in its concept. The concept it deserves, and has fairly won, must be more than a vague Hegelianism such as supersession, the maintenance of what has been negated in its very negation, that is, the negation of the negation. If we return to Hegel for a second, we see that the survival of the past as the superseded is simply reduced to the modality of a memory, which, furthermore, is merely the inverse of, that is, the same thing as, an anticipation. Just as at the dawn of human history the first stammerings of the Oriental spirit, joyous captive of the giants of the sky, the sea, and the desert, and then of its own stone bestiary, already betrayed the unconscious presage of the future achievements of the absolute spirit, so in each instant of time the past survives in the form of a memory of what it has been. That is, as the whispered promise of its present. That is why the past is never opaque on an obstacle. It must always be digestible as it has been predigested. Rome lived happily in a world impregnated by Greece. Greece superseded, survived as objective memories, its reproduced temples, its assimilated religion, its rethought philosophy. Without knowing it, as at last it died to bring forth its Roman future, it was already Rome, so it never shackled Rome in Rome. That is why the present can feed on the shades of its past, or even project them before it, just as the great effigies of Roman virtue opened up the road to revolution and terror for the Jacobins. Its past is never anything more than itself and only recalls to it that law of interiority which is the destiny of the whole future of humanity. I think this is enough to show that, though the word is still meaningful, in fact, not rigorously meaningful, Marx's conception of supersession has nothing to do with this dialectic of historical comfort. His past was no shade, not even an objective shade. It is a terribly positive and active structured reality, just as cold, hunger, and the night are for his poor worker. How, then, are we to think these survivals? Surely, with a number of realities, which are precisely realities for Marx, whether superstructures, ideologies, national traditions, or the customs and spirit of a people, etc. Surely, with the overdetermination of any contradiction and of any constitutive element of a society, which means, 1. That a revolution in the structure does not ipso facto modify the existing superstructures and particularly the ideologies at one blow, as it would if the economic was the sole determinant factor, for they have sufficient of their own consistency to survive beyond their immediate life context, even to recreate, to secrete substitute conditions of existence temporarily. 2. That the new society produced by the revolution may itself ensure the survival, that is, the reactivation, of older elements through both the forms of its new superstructures and specific, national and international, circumstances. Such a reactivation would be totally inconceivable for a dialectic deprived of overdetermination. I shall not evade the most burning issue. It seems to me that either the whole logic of supersession must be rejected, or we must give up any attempt to explain how the proud and generous Russian people bore Stalin's crimes and repression with such resignation, how the Bolshevik Party could tolerate them, not to speak of the final question, how a communist leader could have ordered them. But there is obviously much theoretical work needed here as well. By this I mean more than the historical work which has priority. Precisely because of this priority is given to one essential of any Marxist historical study, rigor. A rigorous conception of Marxist concepts, their implications and their development, a rigorous conception and investigation of what appertains to them in particular, that is, what distinguishes them once and for all from their phantoms. One phantom is more especially crucial than any other today, the shade of Hegel. To drive this phantom back into the night, we need a little more light on Marx, or what is the same thing, a little more Marxist light on Hegel himself. We can then escape from the ambiguities and confusions of the inversion. June-July, 1962. Appendix. I should like to stop here for a moment to examine a passage from Engels's letter to Bloch that I deliberately ignored in the preceding article. For this passage, containing Engels's theoretical solution to the problem of the basis for the determination in the last instance by the economy, is, in fact, independent of the Marxist theses that Engels was counterposing to economist dogmatism. No doubt this is only a letter. But as it constitutes a decisive theoretical document for the refutation of schematism and economism, and as it has already played a historical role as such and may well do so again, we should not conceal the fact that his argument for this basis will no longer answer to our critical needs. In his solution, Engels resorts to a single model at two different levels of analysis. First level. Engels has just shown that the superstructures, far from being pure phenomena of the economy, have their own effectivity, the various elements of the superstructure. In many cases preponderate in determining the historical struggles, form. But this poses the question as to how, under these conditions, we should think the unity of this real, but relative effectivity of the superstructures and of the determinant principle in the last instance of the economy? How should we think the relation between these distinct effectivities? What basis is there within this unity for the role of the economic as a last instance? Engels's reply is that there is an interaction of all these elements, the superstructures, in which, amid all the endless host of accidents, that is, of things and events, whose interconnection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary. So the explanatory model goes like this: the various elements of the superstructure act and react on one another to produce an infinity of effects. These effects can be assimilated to an infinity of accidents, infinite in number and with an interconnection so remote and therefore so difficult to discover that it is negligible, amid which the economic movement asserts itself. These effects are accidents, the economic movement is necessity, their necessity. For the moment I shall ignore the accidents-necessity model and its presuppositions. What is remarkable in this text is the role it attributes to the different elements of the superstructure. It is just as if, once the action-reaction system was set in motion between them, they were charged with finding a basis for the infinite diversity of effects, things and events, as Engels puts it, between which, as if between so many accidents, the economy picks its sovereign way. In other words, the elements of the superstructure do have an effectivity, but this effectivity is in some way dispersed into an infinity, into the infinity of effects, of accidents, whose interconnection may, once this extremity in the infinitesimal has been reached, be regarded as non-existent. So the effect of this infinitesimal dispersion is to dissipate the effectivity granted the superstructures in their macroscopic existence into a microscopic non-existence. Of course, this non-existence is epistemological. We can regard the microscopic connection as non-existent. It is not said to be non-existent, but it is non-existent for knowledge. But whatever the case, within this infinitesimal microscopic diversity the macroscopic necessity finally asserts itself, that is, finally prevails. Two comments should be made here. First comment: this schema does not give us a true solution, but an elaboration of one part of the solution. We learn that in their mutual action-reaction, the superstructures cast their effectivity as infinitesimal things and events, that is, as so many accidents. We see that the solution must be based at the level of these accidents, since their object is to introduce the counterconcept of the economic necessity which is determinate in the last instance. But this is only a half solution, since the relation between these accidents and this necessity is neither established nor made explicit, since, in what is really a denial of the relation and the problem posed by it, Engels presents even this necessity as completely external to these accidents, as a movement which finally asserts itself amid an infinity of accidents. But if this is so, then we do not know whether this necessity is really the necessity of these accidents, and, if it is, why it is. This question is left unanswered. Second comment, it is astonishing to find Engels in this text presenting the forms of the superstructure as the source of a microscopic infinity of events whose interconnection is unintelligible, and therefore negligible. For, on the one hand, we could say exactly the same of the forms of the infrastructure, and it is quite true that the detail of microscopic economic events might be said to be unintelligible and negligible. But, more important, these forms as such are certainly forms as principles of reality, but they are also forms as principles of the intelligibility of their effects. For their part, they are perfectly knowable, and in this respect they are the transparent reason of the events that derive from them. How could Engels pass so rapidly over these forms, their essence and their role, and only consider the negligible and unintelligible microscopic dust of their effects? More precisely, is this reduction to a dust of accidents not absolutely opposed to the real and epistemological function of these forms? And since Engels invokes it, what else did Marx do in the 18th Brumaire than give an analysis of the action and reaction of these different factors? A perfectly intelligible analysis of their effects. But Marx was only able to perform this proof because he did not confuse the historical effects of these factors with their microscopic effects. The forms of the superstructures are indeed the cause of an infinity of events, but not all these events are historical, cf. Voltaire's remark that all children have fathers, but not all fathers have children, only those of them that the said factors retain, select from among the others, in short, produce as such. To take just one case, every politician in government makes a choice among events according to his policies and also his means, and promotes the chosen ones to the rank of historical events, even if it is only, for example, by suppressing a demonstration. So, to sum up, on this first level, 1. We have not yet been given a true solution. 2. Caching the effectivity of the forms of the superstructure, which is all that is in question here, as an infinity of microscopic effects, unintelligible accidents, does not correspond to the Marxist conception of the nature of the superstructures. Second level. And, in fact, at the second level of his analysis we find Engels abandoning the case of the superstructures and applying his model to another object which does this time correspond to it, the combination of individual wills. We also find that he answers the question by giving us the relation between the accidents and the necessity, that is, by finding a basis for it. History is made in such a way that the final result always arises from conflicts between many individual wills, of which each again has been made what it is by a host of particular conditions of life. Thus there are innumerable intersecting forces, an infinite series of parallelograms of forces which give rise to one resultant, the historical event. This may again itself be viewed as the product of a power which works as a whole, unconsciously and without volition. For what each individual wills is obstructed by everyone else, and what emerges is something that no one willed. Thus past history proceeds in the manner of a natural process and is essentially subject to the same laws of motion. But from the fact that individual wills, of which each desires what he is impelled to by his physical constitution and external, in the last resort economic, circumstances, either his own personal circumstances or those of society in general, do not attain what they want, but are merged into a collective mean, a common resultant, it must not be concluded that their value is equal to zero. On the contrary, each contributes to the resultant and is to this degree involved in it. I apologize for this long quotation, but I had to give it in full as it provides the answer to our question. Here indeed, the necessity is established at the level of the accidents themselves, on the accidents themselves, as their global resultant, so it really is their necessity. The answer missing from the first analysis we really are given here. But on what condition do we get it? On condition that we change objects, that our starting point is no longer the superstructures, their interaction, and ultimately their microscopic effects, but individual wills, confronted and combined in relations of forces. So it is as if the model applied to the effectivity of the superstructures had really been borrowed from its true object, the object we are now dealing with, the play of individual wills. It is now clear why it failed with its first object, for that was not its real object, and why it should go on to a second, which is its real object. How, then, does this proof work? It relies on the model of a parallelogram of forces derived from physics. The wills are so many forces. If they confront one another by twos in a simple situation, their resultant is a third force, different from either but nonetheless common to both, and such that though neither can recognize itself in the third, each is nonetheless a party to it, that is, its co-author. So one basic phenomenon appears straightaway, the transcendence of the resultant with respect to the component forces, a double transcendence, in relation to the respective size of the component forces, and in relation to the reflection of these forces on themselves, that is, to their consciousness, since we are dealing with wills. Which implies, 1, that the resultant is quite different in size from each force by itself, higher if they add together, lower if they oppose each other. 2, that the resultant is, in essence, unconscious. It does not correspond to the consciousness of each will, and at the same time, it is a force without a subject, an objective force, but, from the outset, nobody's force. That is why it immediately becomes the global resultant that may be viewed as the product of a power which works as a whole, unconsciously and without volition. It is clear that we have now found a basis and an origin for this force that triumphs in the last instance. Determination by the economy is no longer external to the accidents amid which it asserts itself. It is the internal essence of these accidents. I hope to be able to show, 1, that we are now dealing with the true object of Engels's model, 2, that thanks to this readjustment, Engels has really provided the solution to the problem he raised, 3, that problem and solution only exist as a function of the adequacy of the model to its object. 4, that, as this object does not exist, neither the problem nor the solution exist. 5, that we must find some reason for this whole futile construction. I am quite prepared to ignore Engels's reference to nature. As the model he has used is itself physical, the earliest example of the type can be found in Hobbes and then in innumerable later versions, of which Holbach's is noteworthy as a particularly pure case. There is nothing surprising in the fact that it refers us from history to nature. This is not a proof, it is a tautology. Note that this is merely a matter of the model used and that the dialectic of nature is obviously not at stake in this exposition, for the very good reason that it arises in a quite different context. Epistemologically, a tautology is null and void, but it may nevertheless have a heuristic role. It is reassuring to be able to refer directly to nature, to be sure. Hobbes said it long ago, men tear out their hair or their lives over politics, but they are as thick as thieves over the hypotenuse or falling bodies. It is Engels's argument itself that I should like to examine very closely, the argument which seems at first sight to achieve such a perfect harmony between the model and its object. But what do we find? A harmony between model and object at the immediate level. But beneath this level and beyond, this harmony is postulated, not proved, and in its place we find an indeterminacy, that is, from the point of view of knowledge, a void. Beneath the level of individual wills. The transparency of content which strikes us when we imagine the parallelogram of forces, of individual wills, disappears once we ask, as Engels does himself, about the origin, and therefore about the cause, of the determinations of these individual wills. For we are referred to infinity. Each has been made what it is by a host of particular conditions of life. Each individual will may be simple when it is considered as an absolute beginning, but it becomes the product of an infinity of microscopic circumstances arising from its physical constitution and external circumstances, its own personal circumstances or those of society in general, the external circumstances which are in the last resort economic, And all these thrown together so that side by side with purely contingent and peculiar determinations we also find general determinations, in particular, the one we are discussing, the economic circumstances which are determinate in the last resort. It is clear that here Engels is mixing up two types of explanation. The first type, a non-Marxist type, but one adapted to its present object and to its hypotheses, that is, explanation by the infinity of circumstances or accidents. This form can be found in Helvetius and Halbach. Such explanation may have a critical value, to the extent that it is destined, as was already the case in the 18th century, to refute divine intervention, among other things, but from the point of view of knowledge it is empty. It puts forward an infinity without content, an abstract and hardly even programmatic generalization. The second type, however, at the same time, Engels introduces a Marxist type of explanation when he ranks among the infinite circumstances, which are in essence microscopic, those determinations which are at once both general and concrete, that is, social circumstances and economic circumstances, which are determinate in the last resort. But this type of explanation does not answer to its object, since it represents at the beginning the very solution which it is supposed to be producing and establishing, the generation of this determination in the last resort. To sum up, either we stay with the object and the problem which Engels has posed, in which case we come face to face with the infinite, the indeterminate, and therefore with an epistemological void, or from this moment we take as the beginning itself the contentful solution which is precisely what is in question. But then we are no longer either in the object or in the problem. Beyond the level of individual wills, we find ourselves confronted by the same alternatives. For, once the first parallelogram is given, we only have a formal resultant, which is not equivalent to the definitive resultant. The definitive resultant will be the resultant of an infinity of resultants, that is, the product of an infinite proliferation of parallelograms. Once again, either we trust to the infinite, that is, the indeterminate, epistemological void, for the production and the final resultant of the resultant we are hoping to deduce, the one that will coincide with economic determination in the last instance, etc., that is, we trust a void to produce a fullness, for example. Within the limits of the purely formal model of the composition of forces, it does not escape Engels that the said forces present might cancel one another out, or oppose one another under such conditions. What is there to prove that the global resultant might not be nothing, for example, or at any rate, what is there to prove that it will be what we want, the economic, and not something else, politics, or religion? At this formal level there is no assurance of any kind as to the content of the resultant, of any resultant. Or we surreptitiously substitute the result we expect for the final resultant, and duly rediscover in it, along with other, microscopic determinations, the macroscopic determinations which were secreted in the conditioning of the individual at the outset, this expected result, these macroscopic determinations will be the economy. I am obliged to repeat what I have just said of what was beneath the immediate level. Either we stay within the problem Engels poses for his object, individual wills, in which case we fall into the epistemological void of the infinity of parallelograms and their resultants, or else, quite simply, we accept the Marxist solution, but then we have found no basis for it, and it was not worth the trouble of looking for it. So the problem we face now is this: why is everything so clear and harmonious at the level of individual wills, whereas beneath this level or beyond it, it all becomes either empty or tautological? How is it that this problem, so well posed, corresponding so well to the object in which it is posed, should become incapable of solution as soon as we move away from its initial object? A question which must remain the riddle of riddles until we realize that it is this initial object which commands both the transparency of the problem and the impossibility of its solution. Indeed, Engels's whole proof hangs by that very particular object, individual wills interrelated according to the physical model of the parallelogram of forces. This is his real presupposition, both in method and in theory. In this respect the model does have meaning, it can be given a content, it can be manipulated. It describes apparently elementary bilateral human relations of rivalry, competition, or cooperation. At this level what was previously the infinite diversity of microscopic causes might seem to be organized in real, and discrete, and visible unities. At this level accident becomes man, what was movement above becomes conscious will. This is where everything really begins, and it is from this point that deduction must begin. But unfortunately, this so secure basis establishes nothing at all. This so clear principle merely leads to darkness unless it withdraws into itself, reiterating its own transparency as a fixed proof of all that is expected of it. Precisely what is this transparency? We must recognize that this transparency is nothing but the transparency of the presuppositions of classical bourgeois ideology and bourgeois political economy. What is the starting point for this classical ideology, whether it is Hobbes on the composition of the conatus, Locke and Rousseau on the generation of the general will, Helvetius and Halbach on the production of the general interest, Smith and Ricardo, the texts abound, on atomistic behavior? What is the starting point if not precisely the confrontation of these famous individual wills, which are by no means the starting point for reality, but for a representation of reality, for a myth? Intended to provide a basis, for all eternity, in nature, that is, for all eternity, for the objectives of the bourgeoisie? When Marx had so thoroughly criticized the myth of the Homo economicus in this explicit presupposition, how could Engels return to it so naively on his own account? How, if not by a fiction quite as optimistic as the fiction of bourgeois economics, a fiction closer to Locke and Rousseau than to Marx, could he suggest to us that the resultant of all the individual wills, and the resultant of these resultants, actually has a general content, really embodies determination by the economy in the last instance? I am thinking of Rousseau, whose dearest wish was that the particular wills, cut off from one another, might come together in a fair vote, producing that miraculous Minerva, the general will. The ideologues of the 18th century, with the exception of Rousseau, did not demand that their presupposition should produce anything but itself. They just asked that it should provide a basis for the values already embodied in the presupposition, and that is why the tautology did have a meaning for them, but one obviously denied Engels, who, for his part, hoped to discover the exact opposite of the presupposition. This is why, in his own text, Engels ultimately reduces his own claims almost to nothing. What is there left of his schema, his proof? Just the one expression, that given the whole system of resultants, the final resultant does contain something of the original individual wills. Each contributes to the resultant and is to this degree involved in it. This is a thought which in a quite different context might reassure minds uncertain of their grasp on history, or, given that God is dead, uncertain of the recognition of their historical personality. I would go so far as to say that it is a desperate, honest thought which nourishes despair, that is, hopes. It is no accident that Sartre, basing himself on Engels's question, on the question of the basis for and genesis of the necessity of history, should pursue the same object, with arguments which are equally philosophical, while of quite different inspiration. What have we left now? One sentence in which the final resultant is no longer long-term economic determination, but the historical event. So individual wills produce historical events. But a closer look shows that strictly speaking we can only admit that the schema gives us the possibility of an event. Some men confront one another, something must happen, or nothing, which is also an event waiting for Godot, but absolutely not the possibility of a historical event. Absolutely not the reason that will distinguish a historical event as such from the infinity of things which happen to men day and night, things which are as anonymous as they are unique. The problem must be put the other way round, for once, or rather, in a different way. It is never possible to explain a historical event, not even by invoking the law which makes quantity pass over into quality, if one proposes to derive it from the indefinite possibility of non-historical events. What makes such and such an event historical is not the fact that it is an event, but precisely its insertion into forms which are themselves historical, into forms which have nothing to do with the bad infinity which Engels retains even when he has left the vicinity of his original model, forms which, on the contrary, are perfectly definable and knowable. Knowable, Marx insisted, and Lenin after him, through empirical, that is, non-philosophical, scientific disciplines. An event falling within one of these forms, which has the wherewithal to fall within one of these forms, which is a possible content for one of these forms, which affects them, concerns them, reinforces or disturbs them, which provokes them or which they provoke, or even choose or select, that is a historical event. So it is these forms which command the whole, which already contained the answer to Engels's false problem, whose solution, it must be admitted, he could never have reached, since there was never any other problem than the one he posed on the basis of purely ideological presuppositions, since it never was a problem. Of course, once again, there had certainly been the semblance of a problem for bourgeois ideology, to rediscover the world of history on the basis of principles, the Homo economicus and his political and philosophical avatars, which, far from being principles of scientific explanation, were, on the contrary, merely a projection of its own image of the world, its own aspirations, its own ideal program, a world which would be reducible to its essence, the conscious will of individuals, their actions and their private undertakings. But once this ideology, without which this particular problem could not have been posed, had been swept aside by Marx, how could this problem still remain the problem posed by this ideology? That is, how could it still remain a problem? To close this too lengthy commentary, allow me two more remarks, one epistemological, the other historical. It should be noted, vis-a-vis Engels's model, that every scientific discipline is based at a certain level, precisely that level at which its concepts find a content, without which they are the concepts of nothing. That is, they are not concepts. Such is the level of Marx's historical theory, the level of the concepts of structure, superstructure, and all their specifications. But if the same scientific discipline should set out from another level than its own, from a level which is not the object of any scientific knowledge, such as, in our case, the genesis of individual wills from the infinity of circumstances and the genesis of the final resultant from the infinity of parallelograms, to produce the possibility of its own object and of the concepts corresponding to it, then it will fall into an epistemological void, or, and this is what gives it its vertigo, into a philosophical fullness. This is the fate of the search for a basis Engels undertook in his letter to Bloch, and we find it impossible to distinguish in it between the epistemological void and the philosophical vertigo, since they are nothing but one and the same thing. Precisely this passage, with its arguments borrowed from the kinds of model used in the natural sciences, and ultimately this is their only precaution, a purely moral one, Engels is merely a philosopher. His use of a reference model is philosophical. I insist on this point deliberately, for there is a more recent example of the same kind, that of Sartre, who also tries to find a philosophical basis for the epistemological concepts of historical materialism. He has one advantage over Engels in this respect, he knows it and says so. It is enough to refer to certain pages from the Critique de la raison dialectique to see that if Sartre rejects Engels's answer and his arguments, he basically approves of the attempt itself. All that separates them is a quarrel over the means employed, but on this point they are united in the same philosophical task. It is only possible to bar Sartre from his path by closing the one Engels opened for him. But this makes it necessary to pose the problem of the philosophical leanings which can be detected in certain of Engels's writings. Why beside genial theoretical intuitions do we find in Engels examples of this step backwards from the Marxist critique of all philosophy? This question could only be answered by a history of the relations between Marxist thought and philosophy, and of the new philosophical theory, in the non-ideological sense, which Marx's discovery brought with it. Obviously, I cannot enter into this problem here. But perhaps we have to be convinced of the existence of the problem before we will find either the will or the way to pose it correctly and then resolve it.